hi everyone. I'm so glad to see many of you join us today. My name is Svetla, and as the main organizer, I'll do a little intro of what MentorMate DevTalks is all about. So MentorMate DevTalks is a community for sharing knowledge, experience, and inspiration in the software development field. So our goal is to organize a variety of events on-site and online, let developers, QAs, BAs, and cloud experts learn about the latest technologies, best practices, and most efficient tools. So since it started in 2017, we have organized more than 15 events in Bulgaria, and we're also doing webinars, as you can see. So in today's event, we'll discuss web accessibility for advanced components, and our speaker is Rosen Kanev, who's a senior front-end developer at MentorMate. I hope that you look at the GitHub link we provided you with, so you could make the most out of this webinar. For your ease, I'll paste it in the link in the chat so you can use it easily. Okay, so here's a quick agenda or how the event will go. Rosen will talk for around 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have the last 10 minutes left for questions, which are welcomed in the chat on the bottom of your screen. They will be answered at the end of the presentation. You can ask them at any point of the presentation. We'll just answer them at the end of it. Okay, so that was my intro. Now to Rosen.
Hey everyone. So as Svet mentioned, my name is Rosen Kanev. I'm a senior front-end developer here at MentorMate for about 4 years and a half now. My daily job consists mostly of designing, developing, and maintaining high-quality UI elements, and that includes, among other things, like performance and web accessibility. And since I have so much things prepared for this demo, let's dive right in. The agenda for today, we will talk about getting to know your audience, the type of audience that you wouldn't hear the opinions of it too often. We'll also talk about how to supercharge your development workflow. That includes also testing what you've done and verifying that everything works as you expected it. We'll also go through a live example. It's a simple example of an open source UI control that I created. It's a color picker, and since it's probably the most advanced one I've developed so far, you'll see why I reckon so in a moment. I think it's an appropriate example, and also some more resources and where to go next. For these 40 to 45 minutes, I really can't imagine how we would cover all the possible advanced use cases for creating accessible components. And there's pretty much plenty of information out there that you can reference, and you don't have to watch me showing some of the things that you can use. So let's talk about forms of disabilities. We can categorize them in three forms. That's permanent, temporary, and situational. And I'll give a short example of for each category. Permanent is a type of disability that you most often you would imagine when we're talking about disabilities. It could be motor impairments, it could be visual impairments, and it doesn't have to be users that are completely blind. It could be users that have to zoom in on your app just to see better and for a nicer user experience to them, and to, for example, switch the contrast of the application, whether it's high contrast mode or removing all colors altogether. There's also temporary disabilities. That's your state that you would be in if, for example, you had an accident while you were riding your bike, and now going upstairs is really painful. but you're not in this state forever. You'll get better, but in the meantime, you would have trouble using whether, in my case, it's steps, or a more concrete example would be you went to check your eyes to the optometrist, and your pupils are dilated after the check, and now everything that emits light is too bright for you. And this is only temporary for just 2 or 3 hours, but you really need to look at the schedule of the bus, and you can't, since there's no dark mode, for example. There's also situational forms of disabilities, and these are really just more in the category of annoyances that could happen to absolutely everyone. For example, the brightness of your mobile phone is set to 50%, but you step out of the bus or your car and it's shining bright outside. So now you just can't see anything. And remember that dark mode that you implemented and set as default? Well, now it's going against you and you're struggling to read properly things, whereas a light theme would have done or would have performed better. And another example that I jokingly like to use, if you have a pet, like a dog or a cat sitting in you, perhaps one of your arms is, well, busy with that pet. So now you can't just use any keyboard shortcuts, for example, or access your mouse. You have to use only the keyboard. And part of the examples already explain why building inclusive interfaces matters, but I also list these three. First of all, UX, or the user experience for all users, might even get better. This isn't just a theoretical speculation. This is something that I've seen probably in 60 or 70% of the projects I've been working on. Keyboard accessibility is something that would unlock power users to go through the long submission form really quick. And it's not just for people with disabilities. You just made the user experience of your application better for all people. Building inclusive interfaces also is for having a bigger and more diverse user base. And bigger comes from the fact that if your website or web app wasn't previously accessible to them, they just close it. They uninstalled it, they removed it, and that's okay. They can't use it, so they'll just move to your competitor. But even if it was somewhat accessible, but they couldn't use it, now you have a more diverse user base. If you have a more accessible web app, that means that these people are here not only for looking around, most likely they're here to, for example, shop. They want to get their task done and be finished with it, and do some other, I don't know, to go with their daily tasks. And there's also that it's required by law, and there is an asterisk to that if you're building a personal project, no one is going to go and sue you just because your landing page doesn't have ARIA attributes. But for some countries, there are laws and acts and directives that apply for whole industries, like, for example, healthcare industry in the United States. I think it was called Section 508, and it's mandated to, if you have a digital product, to be completely accessible for everyone and to be accessible above the level A level of accessibility. Let's also talk about the average screen reader user, since most people are already aware of the average internet user, and things are a little bit different here than the average internet user, since screen reader users already have to endure lots of inaccessible web apps, they switch between screen readers. And this is really common since some of the screen readers support some of the web apps better than the other screen reader. And this is different from the average internet user, since you wouldn't close your favorite browser and open just that website in another browser. You wouldn't even install it for that, with minor exceptions, of course. You would most likely stop using it, but the average screen reader is okay with that, and they just want to get a task done, and they will even switch between screen readers. Why am I saying that? That's because you shouldn't be focused on just one screen reader and testing with one screen reader, unless your user analytics show that users are using primarily that. For example, I don't know, 8%. Another interesting fact about the average screen reader user is that they use a combination of Windows and iOS. And what I mean by combination is that they don't use just one device for, that's a popular myth, by the way, that screen reader users or blind users are only using your website or web app on a desktop. No, on the contrary, they are most likely using a laptop, a mobile device, or a tablet. And since the most popular screen readers for a while now, for almost 2 decades, were primarily Windows only, that's why they use Windows as a desktop operating system. Talking about JAWS and NVDA. And for the iOS counterpart of this bullet point, the explanation is simple. Android lacked accessibility features, or at least some of those, for a long time. They've been catching up recently, and some screen reader users will use Android and they will find a way to work with that. But historically, most of the screen reader users would use iOS. As for browsers, we can see that Chrome and Firefox are the most popular browsers on the desktop landscape, and naturally Safari on mobile. Another common theme about the average screen reader user is that they wouldn't download the screen reader and leave it as this. They will, or at least some of them, will heavily customize them, the screen readers. Perhaps they've been used to a certain keyboard combination that gets them all the lists on your website. And you shouldn't rely on those keyboard combinations, for example. And lastly, the average screen reader user will probably have more than one language. And this matters more in regions like Europe or Africa or South America. And they might have their screen reader also be using it in a different language than English. So remember, when you are customizing some of the labels, and I'll touch on that more later, that you would have to also localize and translate that label. Otherwise, they would hear your content mostly in Spanish, but just those some labels will be read in English, which is awkward to use. One of the more important aspects of accessibility in general, not just blind users, is focus management. We have 5 key points here, and these 5 key points revolve around an effective user interface that you could build. We have predictable focus management. This means that going through the tab order of your web app, I wouldn't be surprised as a user if I press tab, I wouldn't be taken to the bottom of the website. Then pressing another tab would get me to the top again. And this could be could be mistaken mostly with different side navigations, and there's some tricks there that should be worked around. There's also the efficient point of focus management, or in other words, what is the most straightforward and short way to accomplish the task at hand, whether it's checking out your cart or searching your website. It should be easier to go to the main content, and that's why we sometimes have skip to the main content links, for example. There's also the aspect of having enjoyable keyboard experience. This, for example, could be a radio group. For example, you've seen radio buttons that, I don't know, are for gender. And one of the ways you can go through it is tabbing through them, but the other is using keyboard arrows. And where this pattern shines using keyboard arrows would be with a large form with lots of tab stops. And if one of the form groups is a radio button group, you could easily go through and even cycle between the end and the first item just by using a keyboard. And another place would be actual tabs and a tab set. There's also the consistency of focus management. And if your UI is dynamic, you should strive for making it consistent if that part currently is disabled or removed from the screen. Just make sure that it's not surprising users. That would be, for example, going into edit mode. In edit mode, some of the controls would disappear, some would be placed in a different place, and you can at least try to make it consistent with non-edit mode as much as you can. And there's also the unobtrusive aspect of focus management. Sometimes people develop things trying to have a tab stop at all possible places. I've already seen, this is a real example of an web app that had a tab index of 0 for practically every element that the developer thought was important. That included headings, that included text that was explaining something on the screen, and that is just obtrusive as far as focus management goes, since now you have a sea of controls on the screen, and imagine that you have to press the tab key 300 times just to get to the end of the page. That would be annoying. Not that I'm saying that blind users are going to do that. There are proper shortcut keys for that. I'm just saying that if you give weight, and that's the common term about it, of having a tab index of 0, if you give weight to your element for all of your elements, now all elements sound important, and then none of the elements are important by that same logic. So just avoid placing tab index of 0 too much. And now we'll talk about how to hear your component. Usually when I do this demo, I show it live with voiceover just to demonstrate how to turn on voiceover and what do you expect to hear or see in this particular case. But I'm going to skip that just because we won't have enough time. But I'll quickly go over what to expect when you're doing that on your own, or perhaps during development. If you haven't already, for Windows, I would recommend to download and install NVDA. And the reason is just simple. It's probably the best screen reader available for Windows, and it's also free. There's a footnote here that the second most popular screen reader as of 2019, of course, costs about $1,200, and that's just too much for trying things. And if your project calls for it, sure, test also with JAWS. That's a good advice that I can give for any type of testing, whether it's different browsers, different operating systems. Same applies to different screen readers. But still, NVDA is a really good screen reader. And I'm not just saying it just because it's free. I tried them both, and I prefer NVDA, and so do most of the users, the screen reader users. As for macOS or iOS, VoiceOver is bundled with the operating system, so you don't have to download and install extra things. And the only thing you have to do is to enable it through the system preferences. And that would probably explain why iOS used to be more used with screen reader users on mobile. But that's really not the case currently in Android. They already have, I think it was called TalkBack. So next step, since you have the software installed and running, I would give you two more generic advices. For when we're talking about advanced components, they're not the usual type of integrated form elements that you would see in the browser. So the browser most likely wouldn't do most of the job for you. You would have to do it yourself. And that includes having the widget in the tab sequence order. That's what I'm talking about, having a tab index of 0 in a specific place. And also you should make it discoverable by placing it in a form. That's a good advice in general. If you have a form control, don't just leave it anywhere in your DOM tree. Place it in a specific form, even if that form is with just that element. For example, a form for subscribing to your newsletter. There's only one button and just one text field. Place it in a form. That way, screen reader users can initiate the keyboard shortcut for discovering the form, and they wouldn't have to tab through all the elements in the UI. Some tips that I can give you. If you don't like waiting for the screen reader to read through all the elements, you don't have to wait for it. You can either increase the speech rate of the screen reader through the settings, and most likely your average screen reader user would have it cranked it up to 11 or at the maximum at what is possible. And also perhaps half of the people that I show how screen readers work feel somewhat uncomfortable with the voice, and there's a way to mute it and use the on-screen description, and I'll show you that during the live example. I placed this quote. I'm not sure who came up with it, but the place that I saw it first was in the Web Accessibility Initiative ARIA authoring practices. And it states that no ARIA is better than bad ARIA. Oh, by the way, if you don't know, ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. So it's just a reference to those area attributes and rows and states that you might have. And the quote here is just explaining that if you place a bunch of rows, states, and properties, ARIA properties, that might end up in a worse user experience for screen readers. And you should first consult the docs, just as usual. Let's talk about accessible names and descriptions, and after that, I'll show you the demo. For what goes into accessible names and descriptions, Well, for the names, names have to convey function or purpose. They also should have the most distinguishing and important words first. So if you have a button for editing something, imagine a table and the last column is edit, and that button is just that pencil icon. You would put a ARIA label there, or labeled by, and now you have to come up with a good accessible name, not just edit. But that's also something dependent on the context. But yeah, put the most distinguishing and important words first. That's edit user or edit user roles, for example. Don't include the role in the name. One of the examples that I could give here is a mute button or sign up dialog. Don't put the word button or dialog in the label. The screen readers will announce the role for you, and it will just duplicate the label or the role name. Then there's creating unique names for elements, and there's just one exception to that rule. But the rule is that for each form field, you would have a unique name. And then that's just the rules of forms in general, but also applies to advanced components. And the exception is if you have that component and that form in two different places at the same time, for example, the header and the footer, you would put the same names for your widget, even if it's duplicated, and that would allow screen reader users to know that this is the same form and form control used to do task X, that they wouldn't have to think about, what does this one do? Is it different from the other? Well, the unique name, or in this case, the duplicate name, would describe that to them. It's actually the same. And then there's preferring ARIA labeled by over ARIA label. And the reason is language. Remember how I talked about that average screen reader user might have said more than one language? And this is why we prefer ARIA labeled by, or at least a part of the reason. And that's because you would already have the label on screen translated. And this way you wouldn't have to sync between the ARIA label of the widget and the on-screen text. And it just would result in smaller payload. Yeah, just easier to maintain in the long run. As far as descriptions are concerned, they supplement the role and the name or the label. They can contain instructions like validation rules, for example. During signup, you would have specific password requirements for users, and putting those validation rules in a description field, in a description field. In our case, that's ARIA described by. You would have an accessible password field without users having to guess what sort of special characters they would have to include. And one good improvement coming to why ARIA v1.3, we're currently at 1.1 and 1.2 is a working draft, but still it would come eventually, is ARIA description. Just like ARIA label is the counterpart for ARIA label, but just for the description. Currently we're stuck with described by only, and this would allow for simple use cases to have the description in line as part of the ARIA attribute. Here's a quick reference table for do's and don'ts with naming things. As usual, strive for brief, useful, and distinctive names. For example, next is not distinctive enough. It could be a name that can be derived from the context, but if you have multiple next labeled buttons, for example, that wouldn't be enough. So do next slide. The second example is delete account dialog. And here the mistake is having the role in the name. Delete account is absolutely enough, since the screen reader would announce that this is delete account dialog, not just delete account. And lastly, we have here a really long name. First, you might think that people would like to hear a longer description of your component. But imagine going through that component several times with the keyboard. Now you would have to listen for this long piece of text several times just to hear its value. Some screen readers would skip it if they see that it's too obtrusive, but you shouldn't rely on that. And you can place that long text not in the label, but in the described by attribute, and just put a shorter label like rate your move. Now, a thing about hiding things from screen readers. We'll talk about when and how you would hide things from screen readers if it is a purely decorative element, an icon, or an image that doesn't bring any new information to the users. You would hide a duplicate label, or if it's an abbreviation, you wouldn't announce the screen reader TSP dot. You would prefer to have it read by the screen reader as teaspoon. And how you would hide things from screen readers. There are 3 ways, but I included the abbreviation element here just for completeness. And the most common one is having the ARIA hidden attribute. That way, what you see on the screen would be hidden from the screen reader. And that in that way, you could hide the icon, for example, or some text that makes more sense with the design that you created, but doesn't make things better for screen readers. And you have something prepared for screen readers that's only read to them. So visually on the screen, you have something, but for screen readers, you have something else. And for each part of your audience, you're providing a better user experience without hiding important functionality. The other type is having the hidden attribute. And this is also the same as having display none in your style sheets for that specific element. But keep in mind that this would hide the element from both screen readers and regular users. So use it with caution. Most often you would use that for multi-step wizards or carousels, those image rotators. Here's an example with the teaspoon. Placing a title would give a hint to screen readers that they should read the title instead of the child content. In our case, that's the abbreviation TSP dot, and they would skip the child content and announce teaspoon. And lastly, we have the aforementioned ARIA label, but there's also an asterisk to that. A common mistake I see from fellow developers is slapping an ARIA label on an element and hoping that the inner content wouldn't be read. And in this case, it's really simple. We have the 5S here in the content, but it could have been a really large DOM tree structure. And ideally, we would like to read something short to users. And the contrived example here is a link. It would work having the ARIA label override inner content, but that's because of the role. For elements with a role that support naming from child content, you can overwrite with ARIA label attribute. Otherwise, the ARIA label attribute content, in this case 5 seconds, would be read alongside with 5s, which, fun fact, screen readers would announce it as fives, as in 5 things. And not really useful for most of the things that you would use it, but hey, that's the specification. You can also show things only to screen readers. I mentioned that here with the ARIA hidden and the display none features. And the way to use it is called the clip pattern. It comes from this CSS property here, the clip. And I'll just skip the technicalities here, but what happens is that the text you put in the DOM tree is read by screen readers, but your sighted users wouldn't be able to see it, since it's a rectangular box of 1 pixels, and you would cut away just a pixel of it. And finally, we got to the example. So the demo I have prepared is a color picker. You can, as a user, pick a different shade of the color. And by shade, I mean actually the hue, by tapping, holding the mouse pointer, and rotating. Also, you can quickly go through the rest of the colors by just clicking on it. And the same treatment is available to keyboard users. So I'm currently focused on this component, and you could tell by the outline here, the blue outline. I left the default browser outline just to be more familiar to users, but feel free to replace it with a different focus indicator if it's enough to distinguish it from its non-focus state. So keyboard users can press the up arrow or the down arrow, and it would go through the hues again. And there's also page up and page down. You might also notice that I've included this slider here. This is the regular input type range you would find from the browsers. And it actually includes the same keyboard support, just like my color picker here. So using your keyboard, it would increase the hue, or if you press the down arrow, it would decrease the hue. And then there's also page up or page down, and even going to the leftmost value with pressing home or end, it would drop the hue to 359 degrees, which is coincidentally also supported to in the color picker. Okay, now that I've shown you how the color picker works, let's simulate how a screen reader user would interact with it. And this is just showing the final example. This isn't something that I came up with overnight. It was a gradual improvement. But at any rate, this is what screen readers would use. And don't be intimidated by that stark red color there. It's just for showing that what is the current selection. Currently, you can't see what is focused unless you're on the button here for displaying the curtain. And that's just by design, just to demonstrate a point, and that is how would a blind user would feel and use your web app. So by pressing tab, I would move my focus on my component, and now by pressing page down, you would see that the hue changes, and something changes. Now This isn't enough for a screen reader user to know that something changed. You would also have it announced. So let me just quickly hide that curtain and show you how
voiceover on, speech off.
VoiceOver would announce it. Now, I've muted it since first it's easier to develop this way. You can keep your music on, for example. But if you are testing something specific, like having pauses between sentences or labels that have colons or dashes, you would check if the pause is there, or if you have a text that should be spelled out letter by letter instead of color to be spelled as C-O-L-O-R, you will just leave it there instead of relying on what you can see here. And just a quick note about NVDA, the screen reader. I don't think that you would see the on-screen text here by default. You would have to turn it on, and just keep it in mind that you might not see it if you're using that on Windows. So let's go through again our color picker, but this time let's see, and I'll just put this text box near what we're doing and just see what the screen reader would announce when tabbing through elements. Initially, my focus is on the body element, and when I press tab, I'm moved to the next interactive element. Notice how the title here, color picker, was skipped. Well, this is a level 1 heading, and users can invoke a keyboard combination to get a list of all headings. So that's why we don't have it in the tab order. And that was what I was talking about when, as a bad practice, you wouldn't include headings in the tab stop, even if initially you would think that it would result in better accessibility. So it says that you are currently on a web content inside of a group, and that's partially useless to me. And if you skip that, you can shift tab and tab again just to make sure that you are able to read that button. It's part of the job of testing accessibility to know these edge cases. For example, this text that we're currently seeing is not really
Margaret Antonov has left the meeting.
and that's how you would hear VoiceOver explaining the notifications. If you heard that, that's just someone leaving the Zoom meeting. Anyways, if you tab on the component, you would briefly see that you have currently selected the blue color, and you are on a color picker, and it's a radio.
Margaret Antonov has joined the meeting.
Sorry about that. And you are on a radio slider in the main content.
VoiceOver off.
And I'll show you how you would accomplish that through ARIA attributes. Here, first we have the main line mark. That's the main element. We also have a form, just as we spoke earlier, about putting components in a form if they're interactive components and changing some state. And we have a div with a role of slider and a brief role description. It's, at least in my opinion, better to call it a radio slider, but you can certainly think of better ways to describe a slider that wraps around. There's also a label. It's called color picker, but in practice, you wouldn't use such a generic name. This here is just the same default, but in practice, you would have a color picker to change, I don't know, the color of your car that you're ordering. So it would say, pick a color for your new car, or something shorter, or car color. There's also a value min, max, and now and text. These are all related and have an implicit value in the case of inputs. And I can't stress this enough. Whenever possible, use native elements like your inputs here, the input type range, or a section, or a nav element, because that skips a lot of manual work. Here, the type range implies that it's an element with a role slider, but to have my component accessible, I have to add that role. Otherwise, none of that would be available to screen readers, and they would just skip my element, or worse, they would read something, something, I don't know, garbage from here. So min and max correspond to the input attributes of min and max. And we also have the value now. You wouldn't see that here, but that's represented from the element's value. So in our case, 249. And the secret sauce here, value text. This is the text that will be read to your screen reader users, and it would replace otherwise 249. So in our case, with, let me just quickly close that and open VoiceOver.
VoiceOver on. Speech off.
Having the color picker say blue instead of 249 is more accessible than the regular slider. See how it says 249 hue slider? Well, 249 doesn't really mean anything to blind users, but blue does the job better, albeit that's not really useful to
VoiceOver off.
all people with visual impairments. And something that I forgot to talk about earlier, visual impairments could be something that is inherited, but it also could be something that users acquired accidentally. So some of your users might have a concept of colors, and this also means that you can represent an otherwise useless value of hue of 249 as something more meaningful to them, like the color blue. And I don't think I have anything else here to show with regards to array labels. Yeah, that's about it. Oh, one thing important here. I have a button at the middle, but it's currently disabled and has a tab index of -1. And the reason is there is just to trigger a workaround for form elements. But the key aspect here is tab index of -1 that would allow me to go through the form elements with just a single tab. So one tab, show curtain, another tab, I'm focused on the color picker, another tab, I'm out. I don't have to tab a second time to go through that button. Right, and this leaves us with some helpful resources that I've gathered. Most of these resources I've gathered during my research for my day-to-day job, or just from my morning coffee and going through Twitter and Hacker News, for example. The most useful, at least for me, was the why ARIA altering practices. And this is also the other secret sauce of that component that you saw. Here we have a list of design patterns and widgets. You can find the color picker here, but you would find something more useful. For example, how to make a slider, a custom slider, be accessible to users. You would see how you should support keyboard interaction, which keys should be supported, and also which role states and properties you should consider and which are required. We already saw that I've already applied the row slider, the now, the min, the max ARIA states, and you would see similar instructions for really even more advanced components than the color picker that you saw. Recently, I had to build a carousel or a slideshow or an image rotator, and I think it was really more demanding than a color picker, since some of the slides weren't visible on the screen, just a single slide visible on the screen at a time. And then there's things that should be read automatically to screen readers. But all of these steps to do that, or the recipe, is here. And I believe it's pretty accessible, excuse me for the pun, for developers. It's not riddled with technical jargon or like some of the specification to be really hard to read. Nope, I think it's really easy to go through. There's also providing accessible names and description section here, along with developing a keyboard interface. Really, this should be your go-to place for referencing when you're building something from scratch. But you don't have to build from scratch. And you can certainly take inspiration from existing libraries or frameworks. For example, in my current project, we heavily rely on Reach UI. This is a React library for accessible components, and it has all sorts of components like sliders again, or a list box that resembles a dropdown with some custom dropdown options. And this is not exclusive to React. DQ University, probably your other best place to get even more expert knowledge, is their code library, currently in beta. But they also provide paid courses if you want to have a certification, for example. And when I say they're the experts in accessibility, I really mean it. These guys have plenty of experience building that and teaching developers like me and you how to build accessible components. And they also have a good library here. You would see, for example, a date picker, along with what you would have to do to get it to run. And that's really useful, not just how to install it, but how to build it yourself. One other source of information and that I really enjoyed was a podcast for accessibility. It was by Wes Boss and Scott Lewinsky, so I dropped the link there. And some other people that you can follow on Twitter, or just go through their blogs. That's Scott O'Hara and Sarah Swedan's blog. They're really knowledgeable on the topic. And I might pretend here that I'm really knowledgeable, but I'm just touching the surface here. There's plenty of things to go more in depth. And I'm certainly not an expert like these guys are, or in Sarah's case, girl. And let's wrap it up. Thank you for joining.
Okay, thanks to Russen for sharing his knowledge. I don't see any questions in the chat, so I'm assuming there is probably none, but I'll still ask you if there's something you may talk right now, or you may type it in the chat if you want to talk to Russen for something. Okay. No one's unmuting themselves, so I guess everything's right. Okay, so that was the event. Thanks so much for joining this webinar, and thanks to Rosen again for sharing his experience with web accessibility. We'll be sending feedback forms after this event, and also the links and the video to this event. So any recommendations you have are very welcomed. You may also email me through my email address where I send you the invite to this event. Okay, so we'll be doing events in July as well. We'll be having probably a July talk, a Java talk in July, and also a QA talk. So if this is something you'll be interested in, join. It's going to be soon in MentorMate's DevTalks social media and website. Okay, so thanks everyone for joining us today. I hope to see you soon.